Morning, everyone. Just getting the meeting kicked off a few minutes early to let people trickle in and getting the YouTube live link up. And muting it so I don't listen to myself with a 10-second delay, because that's weird. Is it Friday yet? Okay, I'm gonna just post the link to the YouTube one on Twitter just in case folks aren't on the Zoom webinar. Okay, so we'll get started in just about a minute. Make sure my phone is muted. All of you are muted pretty much, so I guess I can't really ask questions and get verbal answers back, but I am curious. I was joking around with a couple of the firms that we collaborate with, and obviously most firms are kind of in a holding pattern for deployments at the moment, given that everybody's working from home. We'll talk a little about that at the end of the call if we have time, because there is actually some things that you can do to deploy at home. It's nothing earth-shatteringly insightful from a technology point of view. Some of it does actually involve FedEx, but it does work and it's pretty reliable. I've had to deploy software to job sites like that. So it's 10 o'clock Central. So I guess we'll get started. I blocked out 90 minutes. Today's webinar is kind of funny because I was just tweeting late at night that I was running some deployment tests for Parallax, getting our 2021 stuff ready to go, and some folks said that they would have enjoyed like reading a blog about it, and unfortunately I haven't had much time to blog recently. So recently being this decade, literally like 2010 was the last time I was blogging a lot. Anyway, so I figured we would just throw together a webinar to go over some deployment stuff. I'll really quickly do like an intro thing. If you don't know who we are, myself, John Pearson, Melissa Thiesens, we're Parallax team. Deployment stuff is not normally something we do a lot of for clients. We normally are focused on just helping people be better with all practice technology, whether it's Revit, Navisworks, AutoCAD, Bluebeam, blah, blah, blah. But we do get into deployment stuff for a few of our clients that we're helping with a lot of other things. It's lousy to build somebody an amazing Revit template, a great content library, build them some new add-ins, help them build some badass Dynamo implementation in their firm, and then their IT setup sucks, so everything runs like trash. That's not awesome, right? So in a few cases, we do have 3 or 4 clients where we actually manage all their deployments and their rollouts every year. So it's kind of cool. So we'll go through things kind of in like 3 or 4 steps. So the first thing we'll talk about is actually building a deployment, but not just like the basics. I'll show you some interesting tips and tricks that we use internally that I've been using for several years. So that's going to be the first thing we talk about. The second thing is we will talk about updates, point releases, third-party add-ins, and customizations I'm going to move the Zoom chat over here. Yeah, we will talk about some of the elephants in the room, which are Dynamo, third-party add-ins, point releases, BIM 360, and so on and so forth. We'll talk about bootstrapping, which is actually something from AutoCAD, but we're going to talk about it, and I'm going to actually open AutoCAD for like 2 seconds because we do need to talk about a concept that started with AutoCAD professional deployments, but has now, it's creeped into Revit and Navisworks and everything else as well. And we're gonna take all of the topics from the first three, and then we're gonna show you the actual software, which is called Pragmatic Praxis Deployment Setup. It's a tool that Gordon Price from RFO makes, and that's what I use in our office and in our clients' offices. And it gets into a very like Chevy versus Ford conversation, because sometimes when I tell IT groups at customers' offices that we use PX tools, they're like, well, we have PDQ or we have SECM or we have whatever. And like, that's all good. I'm going to show you all the steps that we do internally, all of them. And if you can get SECM to do them, if you can get PDQ to do them, if you can get any of the other deployment software out there, that's awesome. For me as an end user of Revit or Navisworks or AutoCAD, what I care about is that all of these steps are done well. I don't particularly care which application somebody uses to get there. However, PX Tools is the one that gets it all done for me. And inevitably, every office that I talk to that wants to try using another system, there's always some hiccup. And those hiccups in some of our clients' offices have led to like 9-month delays rolling out software. So having said that, let's just jump right in because it's 5 after and no one wants to sit in PowerPoint all day. I'm going to just run through this, like there's like 2 more slides, and then we'll jump into doing stuff live. So let me just tell you, there are a few things that if you are responsible for doing deployments, or if you are the person who helps IT with deployments, there are a few tools that you definitely need. One is a virtualization platform. I think we're all on Windows 10 at this point, and if you're on Windows 10, I'll show you Hyper-V today. It's free. Like Hyper-V is included in Windows 10. It's been included in every version of Windows since Windows 8. So all you have to pay for to use Hyper-V is some extra Windows licenses, which are like 110, 120 bucks a piece, easily worth it. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. You need a text editor that doesn't suck. Notepad is horrible. Notepad++, amazing. So literally when I was in a bigger office that had several hundred computers, even though the staff generally didn't use it because I would sometimes go to their desk and want to help them fix something, I deployed Notepad++ to every computer in a 700 computer office. It was easily worth its weight in gold. Now, because we're going to talk about this concept of bootstrapping and how it also relates to Revit and Navisworks and Bluebeam, even though it originated in AutoCAD, here's what I can tell you. If you deploy any AutoCAD vertical, whether it's AutoCAD, Civil 3D, ACA, ACE, ACM, AMEP, and so on and so forth. Bob Bell from the AU and Built community, his Twitter handle is in the presentation. He gave 2 lectures like a decade ago in 2009 and 2010. One is on Autodesk CUI or AutoCAD CUIX, and one is on bootstrapping. If you want in a follow-up email after the webinar, I can literally just send them out. They're 10-year-old handouts. They're 100% still applicable. And because I have to set up the bootstrapping and the CUIX for the AutoCAD verticals literally once a year, I forget the steps. So I whip out his handouts every year. And every year when I do it, I tweet to him just to let him know. And it's handy to have. The last thing you need to set up your deployments is you got to have a plan. And that sounds really cliche and stupid, but we're going to talk about like some basic IT strategy, whether it's drive letters versus network places, whether it's how are you planning on getting to physically all of the machines, which of course with the COVID situation is a little different. And I'm not going to solve that for COVID today, obviously. Like I'll show you what you can do, but it's not super practical. Then again, nothing is really practical when your office that was 3 locations is suddenly 200 locations. So that's a different thing. So yeah, we'll jump into there. Like I said, we're going to build some deployments first. Then we'll talk about configuring all that stuff, and then we'll jump into PX tools in the last half an hour. What I want to show you first is what we're trying to get to, right? So if I go to, this is a video. You may have seen it on Twitter, you may not have. It's going to run pretty quickly. It's only 3 minutes long. Basically, whoops, let's turn the sound off on that. I don't think you guys can hear it, hopefully, but this is a video. It's a bare Windows machine, so nothing is installed on it, no Autodesk anything. And the first 30 seconds of the video are actually running at normal speed. So my expectation for the IT person or the BIM practice technology person who's doing the rollout themselves is, after this is all set up, I want them to click one button and it's going to give us this list of what it's going to do. Now at this point, I hit the enter key and I leave for the night, and the video is now sped up like 200%. So it started at 6:15 p.m. It's doing Revit 16. If you read all of this very carefully, so it went Revit 2016, do Service Pack 1, Service Pack 2, R2, SP1, SP2, SP3, all the way through. Then it's going to jump into 2017. You're going to see icons kind of flipping up on the desktop, then you're going to see them go away. That's intentional because well, we're gonna get into all the specific customizations that we do, specific ones that we choose to do. But so now it's been 2 hours that it's been running. It's now going through Revit 2018. It's doing all the point releases, and so it's also you'll notice that it's also doing some interesting uninstalls of Dynamo, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. So as it runs through, it does all the hot fixes, deletes a bunch of shortcuts. It's installing 2020. Goes much faster after it gets all the Revits installed. Naturally, they take forever. So we started this at 6:15 p.m. It's currently rolling up on 10 o'clock right now. I'm downstairs hanging out with my wife and my daughter. So we're at 10:15. We're at 4 hours. Now, keep in mind, I'm not really concerned about the time that this takes. What you just missed right there was all of the AutoCAD, all of the Parallax tools that John builds are now installed on the machine. It did vehicle tracking, AutoCAD mechanical, Civil 3D, FabCAD, MEP. And this is not to brag, by the way. The reason I'm showing you this is it's not practical for anybody to hand over 30 deployments to IT and say we need all of this done correctly. And if you give it to an IT person who's not an expert in BIM, they're going to screw it up. And to be fair, some of our clients have some of the best IT groups I've worked with. This is way more information than somebody needs to know if they're not a power user. So by the way, it finished, I didn't see what time it was. I think it was like 11 p.m. And I've now logged onto the machine. And this is basically the experience that we want to get. So some of you have seen the custom icons, and the custom icons are not really what's special about this. It's all the customization that went in the software. So we're going to talk about that in a bit. I can show you a little more of that later. Videos on YouTube, not a huge deal there. So I like to clear things off my desktop when I'm done with them. So now that we've watched the video, I'll close it. It's gone. Okay, so let me go back to my little thing here. Okay, so let's talk about building a deployment first, right? This is, by the way, this is Revit 2020 that's on my physical machine right here. And we haven't deployed 21 yet. I have 21 on the virtual machine that we're going to look at. But there's a few things that I want to get into, and that is expectations. Because what I can also send you in a follow-up email, and I'm going to be a pain in the ass. If anybody wants the follow-up email, you're going to have to ask for it, because I don't believe in spamming people just because you registered for a webinar. So there is that. What I was going to show you is, it's in Bluebeam. This is what I call a list of rollout instructions. So basically, whenever an IT group asks, why do we use PX instead of PDQ, or what do you consider deploying Revit? This is a list of everything that gets done to deploy Revit 2020. So obviously, there's run the Revit deployment. That's pretty basic. Then there's Service Pack 0.1, update 2020.1. Now, at the time that I wrote this document, 0.2 wasn't out yet, so that's why it stops there. Then we're going to get into the nitty gritty, which is there's a bunch of things you need to know about deploying Revit. Unfortunately, one of those things is that since Revit 2015, Revit has been basically keeping track of where the originating deployment is. It's one of the reasons I always recommend that you use deployments, and I recommend that you don't ever just download and install. So in this particular document, I'm referencing part of the registry, but we've also noticed if I were to go to, so I'm going to open this system root installer folder, and we're kind of jumping in the weeds right away here, but this is important. So if I were to go system root installer, and I have no chance of finding that file right away. So we're going to just sort by name and go 7. Oh, that's right. That doesn't even work. You have to go, let's see if we can just do select text. There we go. And we'll grab this right here. it's a pain in the butt because I don't know what it is about that installer folder, but if you sort by name, they don't go into order, which is kind of funny. Now, this is knee deep in the weeds here, but what I wanted to show you is, by the way, this installer folder is where your icons go. And this is actually where we customize the icons. That's going to come later. But what I want to show you is this file called RVT 2020 MST. So it's RVT-RVT2020.MST. That's what it's named internally because I named our deployment RVT 2020. Okay. Now, obviously, you guys can't respond verbally. So rhetorical question. I don't know how many of you in the last 3 or 4 years have gone to run a Revit deployment and you'll get a random error popping up on the screen about work sharing monitor or format connector or the structural precast add-in. Some weird thing pops up on the screen and you've got to click through it. Next thing you know, your deployment failed. Turns out a lot of these we call them third-party apps because they're not built into Revit, but it's really like second party because it's from Autodesk. A lot of these add-ins and the deployments themselves are tracking the location that you ran the deployment from. They used to track it in the registry, so we've got the registry key right here. In some of the add-ins, they've tracked it in this MST. So if you go to install like a Revit point release and it doesn't find the MST it's expecting, your point release just kind of bonks. So right now, just store that little nugget away. All I want you to know is that's why when you go through the steps of things we do in a deployment, we are manually checking that this value is correct, meaning Melissa is in Salt Lake City, John is in Austin. So if I mail them a machine, we go through a process where what we do is we go to this registry key right here and we change the address of the deployment from the Dallas server to the Austin server or the Salt Lake City server. If we don't do that, that's when like you go to run a point release and it takes like 6 hours because it's loading the deployment across from the other office. Okay, so just a little heads up there. Now, then we said, obviously, we're going to replace our icons, and we like to do that kind of automatically here, but however you want to do it is cool. So we'll replace the icons with the ones that we have on Twitter. Let's see, then we're going to, and here's where things get a little crazy. If you're running Revit server, you've got to change some environment variables. Hopefully none of you are at this point. I'm not an advertising person for Autodesk, but as somebody who had to manage 7 Revit servers, knowing the man hours involved, BIM 360's out, it's way cheaper and better than managing 7 Revit servers. But then you get into your basic stuff, right? You need to see your user data cache, which is like your keyboard shortcuts, your Omni class files. You need to do your Revit INI file. And then we get into some particular things I like to do. And let me just say this right now. You're going to see a lot of stuff in the next 75 minutes that is not supported by Autodesk. I should have thrown the disclaimer on the screen. We don't work for Autodesk. If you do some of this and you break your stuff, we're happy to help you fix it, but some of this stuff is not supported. One of those things is hacking and erasing the Autodesk material libraries. So why we do this, it basically comes down to we have materials in our template that are very specific. So different types of concrete, different types of glass. The last thing I want is somebody pulling in a material from the Autodesk library that's just called glass. I know that glass is handy when you're rendering, but glass is not very specific. So we actually make it so that, and some people may frown if I show this. Oh, those are the assets. I need to remember how to, geez, I never do this. How do you get the little library browser to pop up? Which one of these is it? Nope, not that one. There we go. So if you were to go in here and you were to go look at these, oh, it looks like they are there now. Did I put them back? Okay, so for right now on this machine, they're there. What that step actually does is it blanks out this entire material library, so none of these are here. So they can click on AEC materials, but it's physically empty. It looks like I put it back, and I remember why I had to put it back on this machine because a client needed some help with something. So normally what I'll do is when you click right here, this is blank and you don't see your materials, or you can actually replace it with your own materials, which is kind of cool. Not supported by Autodesk. We'll talk about that a little later. Now, here's a big one, right? So you guys have probably seen the icons that we like to distribute just for the different versions of the software. But for us, it's more than just replacing the icons. When you install Autodesk software, it puts the shortcut on what's called the public desktop. I'm sure a lot of you have discovered you can't delete icons off the public desktop unless you're an administrator. We actually don't leave the shortcuts on the public desktop. That's why when the video ran, you saw them popping up and then getting deleted right away. We're removing them from the public desktop and then putting them on the user's desktop once. So we put the icons on the user's desktop, and then if they decide they want to delete them, it's their desktop, so they can do that. Hopefully that makes a little sense. And by the way, we're going through this PDF because I just want all of you to understand the number of steps we think it takes to do a deployment well. Lots of folks can configure a deployment and just hit run, but these are the steps that really make things a little nicer, right? So then when the user logs in, we're now on what we call a user task, which means this is stuff that's going to happen after a user logs into the computer. So their keyboard shortcuts are going to get copied over. We know that their user data cache, their INI file, and so on and so forth. Then we're going to get into what's called places. So we're going to open a Revit INI file in a few minutes, and you probably know, if you've been in an INI file before, you can configure what's called the places window. So this shows up anytime somebody goes to file, open, file, save, whatever. But when you configure it in the INI file, you'll probably notice there's like 3 or 4 extra icons that Windows shoves in here, and the stuff that you configured is like way down below. So here's where it gets interesting. If you do the places in the INI file, you're stuck with the garbage they put there. If you do it in the registry, you get to move your stuff up in the list, which is kind of interesting. So yeah, anyways, that's just another little tidbit there. And then we do, of course, our copy to the desktop. That way they have their own shortcut they can edit. Now, I'm sure a bunch of you run Dynamo. I'm sure a bunch of you run third-party add-ins. So after you've done all of that, then you've got to start looking at what's required for every add-in that you use. And this is where, like I said, if you try to put this on IT, it gets a little overbearing, because for us, there's Simon Moreau, BIM42. He's got an add-in that we run. We run PyRevit religiously, and we install PyRevit a very specific way. There's the apps that John's building that we call the Parallax apps. There's the Enscape installer. There's Revolution Design's Keynote Manager installer. Kiwi Code's Family Browser installer, 3 CTC installers and copying licensing files, and the BIMTrack installer. All has to get done, and that's before we even get to managing Dynamo packages, which we also want to do. So we're gonna circle back to this. Okay, we're not going to stay in Bluebeam because I said we were actually going to build some deployments. So let's start with step 1. You've probably downloaded your Autodesk software. If you haven't, that's kind of a chore all in itself. You've got to basically go to the accounts.autodesk.com. I'm not going to go through that because it'll kill the bandwidth while it's downloading, even though I'm on fiber. If you've downloaded it, it's probably asked you to put it in C Autodesk. Now, this goes back to those funny pop-ups that people get if they've installed it directly. You can open this Revit thing right here, which is this is what you downloaded from the Autodesk website. You can hit setup and you can install Revit. Now, the deployments here are huge. So this is all the products, or half of the products, or some of the products. And if I were to query this, it's probably like a gigantic size. So chances are you're not going to leave this sitting on every computer in your office. And that's where it gets tricky. If you hit setup and you install Revit, then later when you go to do an update, it's going to go looking for this particular folder. It's not going to find it. It's going to get angry. So this is why we always want to build a deployment instead of actually doing the install. So we've hit setup. This is going to go into the deployment builder. So again, you've got your nasty, I can install it right now and not build a deployment option. And then we've got our create a deployment. Okay, so we've hit create deployment. Now I want to sit on this screen for a couple of minutes and talk through some things. Let's just say Revit sample 2021 deployment, right? And if I go to give it a path, you'll see that it's going to just ask you for a path in the crappy browse dialog, which doesn't work very well. So to start, I've mapped a drive letter on this machine. Okay, I've put the letter I here, which goes to our deployment drive. I want to talk about this for a minute because basically what I want to do is I want to say like Autodesk sample. And you're going to see that when I try to do that, it says no. So I'm sure a bunch of you use drive letters at your office, and that's probably not your decision. That's probably something IT implemented long before you got there. Not for this reason alone. Let me just throw this out there. Drive letters suck. They're a horrible implementation. The reason I say that has nothing to do with Autodesk deployments, by the way. It has to do with the fact that drive letters are a user setting. So when you make a drive letter that says the I drive, which is what I set up just for today's demo, the I drive goes to what we call the deploy share on the Parallax server. So what that means is now I can type in the letter I, or I can single click on this thing and it goes to a share called deploy. Here's what's funny about that. You can also set up what's called a network place. And you'll see that when I click deploy in the network place, it does the exact same thing. I've gone to the exact same place. The difference is it has not invoked a user specific address, which is the letter I. It's used the full path to get to the Parallax server and the deploy share. So this has used a letter, which means as far as Windows is concerned, it's right now used the letter I. That gets super tricky with deployments because you run deployments as an administrator, and the administrator account post Windows 7 is very funky. It's kind of a different phenomenon. So all that to say, I recommend as a company that you try to avoid drive letters, but let's say you use them, okay? Not a huge deal. If you use them, what we're going to talk about as we build this deployment, we're not going to use the iDrive, by the way, but if you use them, the trick is you have to build this deployment without the drive letter, and then you just put the drive letter in after the fact. So what we're going to do after we build this deployment is we're going to go look at the deployment when it's finished. So for instance, I'm going to just go to our deploy share, which is where we just talked about, into Autodesk, and you'll see that I keep all of our deployments sequentially located. And then we have 2 license types. This was actually an emailed question, is how do we handle different license types? So you have to have different deployments for different license types. And we'll talk about that as we get going here. But so if I go into my single user ones, and I'm opening the single user ones because there's no serial numbers in there, right? It's Autodesk ID. And so it's not weird to open it on a webinar. If I go into the Revit one, you'll see that when your deployment is built inside what's called the admin image, which is the IMG folder, there's then an INI file for the deployment, okay? And in all of the INI files themselves, there is an actual address. If you scroll down, there are 2 addresses for where the deployment is and where the log file goes. So this is where, if you need to use a drive letter, because that's how IT set your stuff up, you really just have to get the deployment built somehow. And then you can go in here and you could actually switch this to the letter I like that. And it would, oh, really? And it would now run. Okay, and I could switch this one down here. I'm not gonna be a jerk and do that because this is actually our real deployment that I'm sitting in right now. So we're gonna just close that. Now, here's a little interesting tidbit for you. Most of your computers probably have blazing fast SSDs, and your server is probably not as fast. We're very spoiled because my NAS is in the closet right there. It's got an aggregated link of 4 network ports, and I'm the only person in this office. Our network is super, super, super fast. Building a deployment here on the network is still nowhere near as fast as building it on my hard drive. But the reason I'm bringing this up is we just looked at the INI file and said we could repath the deployment. Well, that means if I want to build all of these deployments, instead of waiting for the deployment builder to push all those files up to the server, I can build them on my C drive or D drive, and then I can just move them and edit the INI file after the fact. Completely valid workflow. So the reason I bring that up is I'm going to just go back to this deployment builder, and I'm going to say, let's build this on my D drive. Now, I happen to have a spare hard drive, which is a D. You could do this right on your C drive if you wanted to. But sure enough, what you'll discover is if you go to do that, I was expecting it to say it couldn't do that. That's kind of funny. Apparently, it's going to let you use the letter D. Okay, what I was actually going to show you is a fun little trick that I use a bunch, and apparently it's not necessary for this. But okay, let's say you wanted to do it the other way anyway. There's a little IT thing called localhost, which is basically your computer. And so if you put in / localhost D $, that basically goes to the D drive. So like I said, I wasn't expecting D to work. That was kind of embarrassing. But basically when I'm building my deployments, I put them in a folder right on my D drive. So if we say D drive single user, and then we called this Revit sample 2021. So this is kind of dumb. You have to put it in again because you want the admin image to go into that 2021 folder, right? So we're telling it, we're going to build a deployment like that, go accept the licensing terms. I mean, you can hit reject, but I'll Newsflash, it doesn't let you build a deployment. And because we're doing single user, we're going to just say Autodesk ID. Now, this is why you have to have 2 deployments, right? So I build one of them that's on Autodesk ID, and I build one of them that's on network, because we still have a couple of Flex LM licenses until obviously this year when they get migrated. So we build one deployment for each. We'll talk about that a little later. And then you get the options, okay? Let me be clear, like, I'm a fan of Revit. I'm somewhat of a fan of, a lot of the Autodesk products, but lately, especially like 2020 and 21, they install a lot of crap. So just as a heads up, when you're building your deployment, if you turn this off, it'll turn off like the base families for Revit 2021. But what we're going to talk about in a few minutes is, even though a bunch of these boxes are unchecked, it's going to throw a ton of trash on your computer, and it's going to end up in the add and remove programs list. We'll talk about that in a minute. Personal preference, if you use it, that's totally cool. You do you. I can't stand the desktop app, so I kill it in every single deployment we build. You will need the material libraries and all that good stuff. Now, if you go in to the Revit dropdown, you get a bunch of options here. So do you want to install the format add-in? If you do, that's cool. Do you want to install the MEP fab stuff? That's cool. Do you want a desktop shortcut? I let it create it because we're going to delete it anyway later in the PX tools. But if you want to just not create the desktop shortcut and then manually create them for the users, you can do that. Now, here's what's funny. You get the option for like either configuring all this stuff or just using your own custom INI, or like using the default INI but your own template. I don't do any of my customizations in the Revit deployment anymore. You can do them here. So if you're not going to use PX tools, you can like just path to your custom INI file right here, and the deployment is supposed to pull your INI file in when it deploys on the machine. Similarly, you can also do what's called running additional files. And I want to give Autodesk some kudos. They did this like a number of years ago in response to all of the third-party add-ins that were out now. Like there's all these developers making, John makes software that goes on top of Revit. So they did give us a way to basically choose additional files that you could install. And there are, I forget where it is, somewhere in here, but there's a way to like put a file in here and then also put arguments on it. The trouble is, while it was well intended, it's not a great setup because all of the third-party add-in developers get to decide what their installers need. So it might be just an installer that you can run with an argument, which Autodesk lets you do. But if you need to copy a settings file, if you need to load a config, if you need to do something else, you're kind of hosed. So I end up not using this, and then I do it through another measure, which is again going to be the PX tools and stuff. So at the bottom, you can decide, is the computer number included in the error reports? Do you want to receive notifications of resolution? So I'll just give you a tip. This is what I do. I say yes, no, and yes. And the reason why is I definitely want the computer name in the error report, because I've met the actual folks who get the error reports every time you submit one of those, and they're geniuses, and they can send you some really interesting information. And there was a day once I was driving to the airport at 5 a.m. and I got an email from Anna Oscarson at Autodesk, who had reviewed one of my funky crash reports and found something weird, and it was a really cool conversation. They need to know what computer it is for that to fly. Allow users to receive notifications of resolution? Heck no, and here's why. If they're not on a point release, and they're not on a point release because you're still trying to wrangle IT to get the point release installed, if Revit crashes and it goes through the system and they discover that they're not on the point release, it will freaking email them and tell them to install the point release. So no. Lastly, if you're on Revit server, you could basically type in your Revit server here, and it's supposed to do the environment variable for Revit server. This gets into why I use the PX tools for handling the Revit customizations instead of doing them in this Revit deployment builder. I don't remember what year it was, 14 or 13. The deployment creator was broken, and you would put in the Revit server accelerator name right here, and it just wouldn't do anything. That costs the company I used to work for like several days, because we rolled out a new version of Revit. Everybody tried to open Revit server, and models were taking like 40 minutes to open. So I'm a little jaded. It works now. They fixed it at a point release, but all that to say, I don't use it. And because I hit custom Revit INI, it's looking for a file. So I'm going to put it on default because, again, I'm going to do my customizations post deployment, and I'm going to take that out because that's not really a Revit server. Now, because I told this thing to build on the D drive, you're going to see that like the time it takes to build this thing is actually pretty quick. We're not going to sit and watch it the whole time because it's 10:30 and that would be ridiculous. So we'll let that build. And I'll take a quick drink here. Okay, so what I do want to talk about is, let's say this thing got built, right? And I've got all of them sitting on my C drive still because I built them a few weeks ago when I was first tweeting about it. So this is where, if I go into any deployment, this is recap, for instance, but you'll see there's going to be two INI files in the IMG folder. One is like the stock Autodesk one, and the one that's named the same thing as your deployment, that is your deployment's INI file. I was going to go into the Revit one, but apparently I don't keep this stuff on my D drive, so I moved it to the server and then I deleted it. So I'll just actually go to the server and we'll open the Revit one. I will make a copy because I really don't want to break this stuff in 2 weeks and then not remember why it's broken. I'm going to move Q&A over here as well. I didn't realize that the Q&A was different from the web chat. That's kind of funny. Yes, the YouTube link will be available after the stream. I tested it last night. Apparently YouTube records stuff. I'm kind of a noob at like doing all this stuff. But let's get into some nitty gritty here, okay? So this is your INI file that's built by the deployment creator. We're gonna drag it in the Notepad++. Like I said, this software is free for download and it's freaking amazing. And if you work on deployments, you need it, okay? So in your deployment INI file, there are two locations where there is an address for where the deployment is. And they're about 80 lines down. So there is admin image location. That is the actual deployment. And then there is the network log path. And I'll give you a couple of interesting tips here. They don't have to be the same. So if you want to store your logs somewhere other than your deployment, you can do that. Gordon Price, who develops the PX tools, if you're an actual IT person and you're responsible for managing the logs, he made an interesting discovery recently that the logs can have a computer name wildcard in them. So you can separate your logs by computer, which is really cool, but more on that later. This is where, if you need to change your address to a drive letter because IT made you use a drive letter or something, you can come in and do that as we talked about, and then you can change it down here as well. Now, we already said we could do that, and I'm going to not do it. There's more I want to talk about in here. Okay. Yeah, Matt, we'll definitely make this available later for viewing as well. It's being recorded using two different methods. So here's what I want to talk about. Deployments from Autodesk use a large number of dependencies on other things, C++ redistributables, .NET, and so on and so forth. You may have experienced a lot of this in the past. So what we're going to do is we're going to just scroll down through the Revit deployment INI file. By the way, before you edit this, do a save as, because you're going to jack it up one of these days. I've jacked up a lot of them. You're going to see a section called RVT. This is the Revit install, right? So it's basically showing you what it's going to do in the Revit install. And if you see here, there's a line called prerequisites. So this is all stuff it's going to try to install prior to the Revit 2021 deployment. I'm not a programmer, by the way. I don't know what any of this stuff is other than just, nudging around in this file and looking for it. But VC redists, these are basically your C++ redistributables. And there is something really important I want to talk about here. We'll get there in a second. Okay, .NET, it's going to try to install whatever version of .NET Autodesk wants to use. Now, here's where it gets cool. Then there's what's called postrequisites. And there's a bunch of stuff in postrequisites. And you'll kind of need to look and see what these things are. In 2021, not to bash again, but there's more of this crap. And you'll notice that a lot of these look like language keys. Like there's your ENU, for English United States. And there's all these other languages in here. And basically it's installing some provisions for the other languages in there. Now it puts them in the add remove programs list. It's super annoying. You can delete them. Apparently I didn't in this particular deployment, but I did it in the multi-user deployment. So, you can actually go in and delete these and it's going to try to skip over them now, or it's going to skip over them. Now, here's the thing you need to be careful of. If you delete something Revit actually needs, Revit might still install and you might bonk your Revit. So just be careful about what you take out of this file. And this is why you definitely want to have virtualization, because you want to test your deployments on a machine that is not yours. I can't say that enough. If you are a BIM manager or a VDC or a practice technology person, you should never be experimenting on your machine. This is my physical machine. Like we're actually on my actual Parallax machine. My machine is identical to Melissa's. My machine is identical to John's for the most part. His is a little different because he codes. But if you test something on your machine and you jack it up, you're going to be in big trouble. This is where Hyper-V comes in. Hyper-V is a pretty basic by Microsoft hypervisor that allows you to build virtual machines. If you run on a Mac and you use, I forget if it's Parallels or Boot Camp or both, it's basically that. These are secondary computers that are on my computer. Now, this means that you want to have a boatload of hardware, because if I give this virtual machine 8 gigs of RAM, it takes 8 gigs of RAM from my computer. That's why right now my computer is using 24 gigs of RAM. But this is a whole separate machine. Okay, and so this is basically a machine. This one right here, 03, is my machine that is my current setup. So it looks identical to my computer. 2020 is deployed. This one in the middle is where I do all of my deployment testing. So if I launch that one, this is actually a whole nother computer that's running on my computer, and this is where I have 2021 deployed. And the tweets about this are kind of how we got started here today. So I do all my testing on this machine, and I literally scrap this machine like 5 times while I'm just getting deployments ready, because if I see any customization that I don't like how it goes, I vaporize the VM, tweak my setup, and rerun it. If you're IT folks, oh, so that deployment's done, by the way, so it's now built. So you want to have some sort of virtualization. Like I said, because I have 3 of them, it's 3 extra Windows licenses at $100 each or $120 each, but easily worth its weight in gold. So you want to be testing on a VM. You do not want to be testing on your actual machine. And here you'll see we're actually in Revit 2021 on the VM. It does run slower because Hyper-V does not leverage GPU power. So like I've got an RTX 2080 Ti in this machine. This VM will not use that at all. So like don't try to run Enscape on your VM, it'll suck. But for testing deployments and actually just getting in and wanting to check things like your third-party add-ins and your templates and stuff, it's great. Okay. Now let's get back to where we were in I hell over here. So there are these things called post-requisites. You can take out all the language ones. There's a few specific ones that I want to talk about. So first is all this stuff that says VC Redist and .NET. If you grab one of the ones that says Redist, or actually if you just scroll down or start collapsing these, you'll see Revit, a bunch of Revit stuff, core content. Then you'll see all these funky little add-ins, you know, Revit server stuff, blah, 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 blah. If you go down far enough, you're going to start to see the prerequisites and the post-requisites. So I'm skipping the post-requisites right now. We'll come back to those. This will save you some serious freaking headaches if you build deployments. Oh my gosh, I'm going to just scroll because that's taking forever. Let's see here. Here we go. Okay, third-party components. So when you get down here into what they call VC Redist, these are all the stupid C++ redistributables that Autodesk wants to check and put on your machine. Now, I'm not going to get into a whole bashing thing about this, but it has to do with the way Windows is set up. And basically, Revit is going to try to install this C++ redistributable, and it may fail to install it. And in some cases, it'll fail to install it because there's already a newer one on your machine. If that fails, there's a chance it'll fail your Revit deployment as well. That's where this line right here comes in. Ignore _ failure equals yes. Now, Autodesk has actually gotten a lot better about this in 2021. They're putting ignore failure equals yes in more stuff. And in my opinion, that's a positive thing. This means if this installer fails, the deployment will keep going. So the first thing I do with all of my deployments, not just Revit, like AutoCAD, Navisworks, whatever, is I take ignore failure equals yes, and I make sure it's in every single one of these. And if it's not, I add it in. You don't have to add it at any particular place. You can add it right at the bottom like that, which is what I do. Some of them also have ignore errors. That's cool. I even do it. So here's where it gets funny. .NET does not have it, and I even add it down there. Now, I want to be clear. Autodesk probably won't condone this because Revit relies on .NET. Like if .NET's not there and Revit succeeds at installing, it's probably going to be a bonked installation. But in my 15 years of doing this with Autodesk software, I'm going to run the risk that .NET's already on the machine, or that it's going to succeed. So I'm going to do that for basically all of these similar things with the Windows updates. I'm going to just tell them ignore failure because good grief. If you don't, you'll go down like a rabbit hole of troubleshooting that just sucks. So that's kind of a big one, is I would do that. Now, here's where things get touchy. If you're one of our customers, you did get an unsolicited email from me last year because they released some point releases. I'm sure you all got the emails from Autodesk about TLS security updates and all this stuff. Okay, now that's all serious, legit stuff. They had to release some security updates for BIM 360. The trouble is, BIM 360 has two items called PACR, which is Personal Accelerator, and RCAO, which is basically whatever, the Revit collaboration tool. They are sort of separate from Revit. They get installed as a post-requisite, but they are kind of separate. And what gets tricky about that is, let's say you've got Revit's 18, 19, 20, and now you're going to 21. If you remember, they sent out a point release for like 19 and 20 and at the time, and that updated your versions of RCAO and PACR. Now that means if for some reason you had to go reinstall 2018, your 2018 deployment may have failed because it's going, it gets to this old version of PACR and RCAO and it fails. Okay, so I just want you to know about that, and I'll tell you there's a couple of things that you can do here. So one of them we just talked about, you can add in ignore failure equals yes. Now, I want to be clear about this. If you add in ignore failure and RCAO fails and it's not already on the machine, you'll have Revit installed and BIM 360 will not work. I've seen that happen. It's sometimes fixable. It's not a massive ordeal. I do recommend putting in the ignore failure though, because in the event that, again, it's already on the machine, it will fail. Autodesk has done a positive after last year's kind of kerfuffle, and they've added it into PACR already. Now, there's another more aggressive approach, and this, take this advice at your own risk. I'm not recommending that you do this, but the other approach is similar to all that language stuff that we were talking about up here that you can kind of remove. You can remove RCAO and PACR from here. Now they're not getting installed at all, but now you have to make sure with IT that they're installed and managed and up to date. And a few notes about that. I've got 2019.2 sitting in a folder here. This is what they shipped out for 2019.2, okay? It's an EXE. There's a bunch of different ways that you can extract an EXE. If you wanna know the quick, easy way that I do it, you can basically go to that folder. I'll have to stop talking while I do this real quick, just while I type. So if I go to this folder, I'm now in that folder. If I say run the 2019.2.exe with the flag -e, and then I give it a folder, desktop, extractor, stuff. Okay, now desktop, extractor, stuff. Yeah, so if we do that, run the point release that we got, extract it and put it in a folder called stuff. What you're actually gonna get is it's not gonna run the installer. We're gonna get a folder called stuff. And this is where it gets kind of cool. If you were to go look at what's actually in this installer, you would see that it's Dynamo getting updated, right? So we get a new version of Dynamo at every release. That's kind of fun. We get RCAO, and then we get Revit Service Pack 6. So don't aggravate yourself. 2019.2 is actually 2019 SP6. What's important about this is you'll see that RCAO is in here. Sometimes PACR is in here as well. They have their own version numbers. Okay, and I forget where they list it, but basically they have their own version numbers and it's tracked separately. So I'm telling you this just in like an emergency. I can actually see the chat. So Chris had a question of, is this one of those, isn't one of those only applicable to the version of Revit? That may be the case. I'm not entirely 100% sure. PACR I know is shared amongst all versions. So PACR is a global component, and that's why I'm saying sometimes it gets tricky. RCAO might be version specific. I haven't decoupled ours because I haven't had a need. So it hasn't come up for us. So far in my client's office where I've seen it, PACR is the one that's a pain in the butt. But I just want you to know that you can extract these in an emergency and find the PACR update, right? Because if you want 2019.2, that's really what you want. And then the Dynamo updates, of course. Okay, so wow, that was a lot of stuff. Now, Dynamo is another one that we should talk about because Dynamo is in here as well. I don't remember where in the list it is. I might have already deleted it while I was just going crazy while I was talking before. But the Dynamo updates are in here as well. So we're gonna close that without saving it. And then we'll just go back in and see if it was in there. So let's see here, back down to Dynamo. I'm a Zoom noob too, don't feel bad. Okay, so I don't remember exactly where they do the Dynamo one. It may be bundled now, so it may be a little, that's right, it's bundled now, so it's probably not listed as an actual post requisite, right? So it used to be a post requisite, and you could do the same thing where you could remove them. But we'll come back to Dynamo in a little bit. Okay, now I want to jump into another little topic here that has to do with when we were building the deployments. When we were building that deployment earlier, we had that option to include updates. That was down at the bottom, right? It said you want to include another installer, and we said, oh, that's cool because we can use that, like, for third-party add-ins and stuff. The original intent behind that was you could add in your point releases. So if you went into your deployments, you could actually go into 21 and you could do a modify deployment, and then you could add in the 0.1, the 0.2, the 0.3 releases. Personally, I recommend never doing it. We like to keep users like on the same build, and if you go into your 2020 deployment as an example, and you tell it to include 0.1, 0.1, 0.2, 0.2.1, there's a chance that for some freaky reason, you might need to install Revit 2020.0. And if you've edited the deployment to have the updates in it, you don't have a way to do that anymore. So I prefer to keep them all separate and then to just have a third-party tool run them in sequence. Now, a little note about that, if you were watching the video of the full deployment that we watched a little earlier, so this is a slightly different video. This is updating a machine from 2020 to 2021. And I'm going to just skip ahead because I want you to just watch. So here when it's running, did I already miss it? Yeah, it's on 21 there. Let's see if I can find it. No, I can't find it. Okay. What I was going to say is there's always this discussion every year about, well, doesn't 0.2 also include 0.1 and 0.1 and so on and so forth? And usually they do. Me personally, I still run them all in sequence. Now, 2018 was like one random exception because things ran so poorly with 2018 that I ended up turning off like the first 3 updates in lieu of like 2018.2 because 0.2 basically installed all this stuff and they were failing left and right. But I tell RPX tools to run them in sequence, even though it takes a little longer because then I'm getting a consistent result. I'm not saying I've looked into this, but I'm afraid to have somebody do a deep dive on a machine that goes 2020 and then 2020.2 versus 2020, 2020.0.1, 2020.1, 2020.2. I'm afraid there may be differences I'm not aware of. So I run them all in sequence. So there is that. Now, while we're building all this deployment stuff, something that does come up is Dynamo. I'm sure all of you have discovered that by now. Dynamo is included, which is a positive step, I think. Managing Dynamo install versions was kind of a brutal task. And now all we're left with is packages, right? So we've got basically packages for Dynamo that we want to manage. And so we're going to come back and circle to that in a few minutes. But what I want you to just take out of that for now is we're leaving the Dynamo install. Well, you kind of have to at this point, but I want you to be aware that there are the new all the 2020 point releases install a different version of Dynamo. So that gets to be kind of interesting because of where your packages go. So according to Autodesk, they go in your roaming app data. You go under Dynamo and then am I in the wrong folder? No. So each folder or each version gets its own subfolder and there's packages there. Now John could explain this a little better than I. I believe on the first launch of the new Dynamo, it copies your packages from the slightly older version. But that gets a little weird because like if you're in 19 and 20, you may have 2 different versions of 2 point something. And you may still be using both of them. So we're going to circle back to that. Just want you to be aware that it's something to consider. Okay. Okay, now we're going to jump real quick to a little AutoCAD lesson because it's going to kind of all dovetail together at the very end, I promise. John confirms, yeah, Dynamos has copied them between the versions. What I was hoping to clarify though, John, and it's okay if you're not 100% certain, I'm not either. I think it only copies them the first time. I don't think it copies them every time, which is what we kind of want to address a little later. And Sven, thank you for thanks for that. Yeah, that's our Parallax logo down on the start menu. This isn't going to derail us, but I want to talk about this a little bit because something else that we do on our end, and again, this is a luxury afforded to us because we're using PX tools, but I'm not sure if you've noticed this from the Windows 7 to Windows 10 transition. And again, this is not a bash fest, but Autodesk does not have their stuff together in terms of how the start menu works. So a lot of the apps go into folders called like Autodesk, AutoCAD, Civil 3D, whatever. They put the word Autodesk at the front. Some of them do not, like Revit. And in Windows 7, they all went into a really tidy Autodesk folder, which actually Microsoft is basically stopping folks from doing now. The nice thing about using an automated deployment tool is we can actually redo our start menu exactly how we want it. So we have classic shell running, which means we get the older start menu look. I mean, you get the new one as well, but if you like the old one like I do, you get that. And then all of our Autodesk programs are very neatly in an Autodesk folder, and we've stripped off all the erroneous like languages and the names, and our AutoCAD shortcuts are here, our Revit shortcuts are here. Super easy to do if you just have a tool that allows you to do it, which is kind of fun. So we'll come back to that in a bit. Here's what I want to talk about AutoCAD for a second. Rhetorical question because you can't answer. I'm not sure how many of you used to have to deploy AutoCAD in an enterprise way. And I don't say that to be condescending, but I don't mean like we install AutoCAD and we're done. AutoCAD has a very complex UI setup that we don't have in Revit. It uses CUIX files, which allows basically an organization like Parallax or like an architecture firm or a general contractor to basically describe exactly how they want the UI to look. Now, we don't have to do this in Revit because there aren't a whole lot of UI options. Even though we barely use AutoCAD, I still deploy AutoCAD correctly with an enterprise CUIX file and a user CUIX file. I'm going to recap briefly in case you don't know what the whole point of that is. Basically, when we deploy AutoCAD, and I goofed it up in 2020, so John and Melissa, if you launch AutoCAD, you get one pop-up that's annoying, but I'm going to fix that this year. Basically, we have everybody set up with what they call a user UI. And that means that you can come in and you're like, yeah, I'm dragging some ribbons off because I don't care and whatever. Let's move this one down here. And now my UI is like all jacked up, right? Now, here's why firms did this, by the way. Users would accidentally break their UI. It would happen all the time. Ribbons would disappear. They'd come in and there'd be no ribbons because they weren't connected to the network or something. So the whole point of the enterprise CUIX is anytime I want to restore anybody's AutoCAD UI, I just come down here and I click on standard again, and they all go back to where they're supposed to go. And then I basically just brute force delete the user stuff because I just say, let's just put this back. We're going to write over the user's settings with a new UI. And now they're back to being able to customize whatever they want, right? So when we were on the enterprise one, you couldn't move anything. It was locked down. Now, the point of this is not to talk about AutoCAD. The point is, if you go back to those Paul Aubin documents, I'm sorry, Paul Aubin documents. I said that because I'm looking at my chat and I see Paul in here. Hey, Paul. If you go back and look at those Bob Bell reference documents that I'll send you later, the way this is done in AutoCAD is they use this technique called bootstrapping because Micah, I use AutoCAD all the time. I mean, because we've got ACA to look at files from consultants. We've got Civil 3D, ACE, Map 3D. Anyways, the process of bootstrapping, if you were to go look at the handout from Bob Bell, it involves building these files that live on the server. But then before the user launches AutoCAD, the files have to get copied into their app data. Okay, now that means that you need some vehicle to move files before the user starts the software from the server to their C drive. Now, IT guys have all kinds of, IT people have all kinds of ways they like to do that. Batch files, GPOs that handle stuff at login, and that's all good. But once I realized we had to do it for AutoCAD anyway, we started looking at what kind of customizations would be handy if we also did them for Revit. And this is why, like when we look at our deployment stuff, we don't use the customize the INI inside Revit's deployment. We actually just do it ourselves because basically we're just bootstrapping the INI. We're saying copy the INI from the server to the user's directory. And this is where I want to talk about how we actually deploy our software internally and how we also do this for clients, by the way. And I want to be clear, I've been using, and this is it's not an advertisement, but I've been using PX tools for coming up on 10 years now, not just at Parallax, obviously. I used to be responsible for 700 machines that were spread over 7 offices. And we used PX tools in that environment as well. I use it currently at several of our clients' offices where I remote in and help them deploy every year. One or two of those clients actually fly there once a year for the big deployment weekend. Now, a few things that we'll talk about there. As you saw in the video at the very beginning, PX Tools is basically a series of routines that are purpose-built. So let's see where I want to go here. Give me 1 second. Yeah, we'll just go here. So let's do it on a VM. Let's not be stupid. I'm going to break my computer. Okay, so here's a machine. We're on one of my test virtual machines, so don't get confused. You'll notice all of 2021 is not here. We only have 2020. So in PX Tools, you basically declare, think of like a musician getting ready for a gig. They declare a set, like what are they going to play that day? So it's not a task-based set. Think of it more like an album where you're defining what should be on the machine when the machine is done. And then the way it runs is pretty quick. And what's nice about this is IT doesn't have to know what you're doing. Basically, this is a computer that's already current as of 2020. And all I have to tell the IT person is you need to tell all the machines to run conform to the set, which means update me based on what is supposed to be in the set. Now this is PX Tools, and it's not actually doing anything yet. It's going to ask me to go in a second because I have it set to pop up. Excuse me. But you'll notice if you look in this list, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, and then Revit 2021. Well, 16, 17, 18, 19, and 20 are already here. It's going to skip that. It's going to say, I'm already done. 21, it's going to install. And then it's going to systematically go through and it's going to say ACA 2021, cool. ACM 2021, cool. It's also going to say, hey, ACA 2020 is here and it's not supposed to be here anymore. And if I were to hit this, you're going to see the first thing it starts doing is it's going to start yanking software off the machine. So it's really great because it's actually going to do the uninstalls for us as well. And yes, Micah, buy Cortana is a package for us, and it actually disables Cortana and turns that bar in the start menu just into a local search because screw that. So we just had a question come in, and it's about the INI file. And the question is, can you do it via the user data cache and then wipe out the user's INI? Yes, you technically can. It's a bit brute force. And in a couple of minutes, I'm going to show you why I like this method a little better. That's a great question. And to be clear, the INI totally can be managed on the Autodesk side, but it's super difficult to understand and to get it to work correctly. So good question, but let's jump back in. So we're back on my machine now. So yes, buy Cortana is a package. We got some fun comments about that. All right, let's go look at what basically makes up PX Tools for what we're doing real quick here. So the first thing we're gonna look at, why did I close all those? I wanted those opened. Thank God it's Friday. If today wasn't Friday, I'd throw my computer out a window. Okay, so we just had a great question come in from Josh, and the question was, does PX Conform still check against the registry key, or does it look at installed GUIDs? So we're going to get to that in 1 second. So here is basically the set that PX Tools is running. I know it's Thursday. It's a joke. So here's a set called BIM Desktop, and you'll see it's going to go 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, then ACA, and so on and so forth, and it runs all the stuff. Now, the set runs what's called a package. Now, what's cool about that is every package can have its own steps. So here is my package for Revit 2021. The one that I actually ran was called multi-user. That's what the MU is for. So I got emailed a question, by the way, that was how do we handle different licensing? for single user, multi-user, FlexLM versus Autodesk ID. So you have to have different deployments. And with PX tools, that basically means that at the moment we create different sets. So this BIM desktop one right here, this is my machine that's in the Dallas office that runs off the FlexLM server, because the FlexLM server is actually hanging out in the closet over there. So John and Melissa are on the single user Autodesk ID ones, which is also what all of our laptops are on. So then there's another one that's basically called, it's got a funny set name, don't need to worry about that. But so here the deployments are all prefixed with a different letter, and this is just some old nomenclature. But the short version is you have to have different deployments, and then you just use different sets to run the different deployments. So we have some machines that are called laptop, some that are called desktop, desktop with different licensing, and so on and so forth. So it's not super bad. We don't have a ton. Like, that's all the sets we have in the entire company right there. Now, coming back to that, each set lists out packages. So Revit 2021 is a package. Now, if we go look at that package itself, this is all stuff that you get basically in the PX tools, and you copy and paste basically. So you don't have to know this syntax. Like, you get a package called Revit 21, and then you basically just modify it. And what you modify is, here is where my deployment lives. Okay. What's really cool about this, for those of you who are in multiple offices, but who don't have DFS enabled in some way, is you can turn parts of your path into what's called a variable. So we have 3 servers. We have Parallax 1, Parallax 2, Parallax 3, because we have 3 locations. So recently we enabled DFS namespace, but before then, we could just write in location root. And that meant that if we go to locations, everybody could have a different server path, and we didn't have to make different sets in PX tools, which was really great. So you're cutting down on the amount of work that you have to do. So it looks super more scary than it really is, but when you consider that a lot of it's copy and paste and just replace your path, it's pretty basic. We have Rollout 2021. Now here we have some grayed out point releases, and they're grayed out because 2021 doesn't have any point releases yet. So basically what I do every year is I take my 2020 files and I copy them, and then I do a massive find and replace, and I replace 2020 with 2021, and then I just gray out all the point releases. You've got to change a few extra things here and there, but if you do it this way, it's crazy fast to set up every year. And the only trick is you have to make sure that you're super careful about naming things exactly the same. So I use simple codes for what the deployments are called. And if you were to go to the 2020 folder, you would see that they're basically called the same thing with some exceptions. I did change some prefixes this year because the licensing changed, but by and large, I try not to make changes year after year. So if you look at 2020, and then if I were to go in and surgically change this path to 19, yeah, really. I probably have 1 extra underscore in there like a jerk. They're supposed to be the same. Question coming in real quick. Is the location root part of multi-office PX tools? Yes, it is. Yeah, and I mean, even when I was a single office, I would basically get the multi-office anyway, because it lets us, we make a separate location called traveling, which is really cool. If we have time, we'll get into that, but I have a feeling we may not get there. Now, I want to just zoom out real quick and look at the basics of something here. So let me just collapse all this stuff. And what I want to look at is, come on. Guess I could have left all that there. So the PX tools themselves do a few different things. So basically, for every package, for every piece of software you have, there's what happens on the machine side. The machine side is when IT runs the conform. So what am I doing on the machine side? You then get to set up your own list of stuff called what happens every time a user logs in. Now, you can make it every time a user logs in or one time a user logs in. It's your choice. Now, you get a machine side and a user side that happen during rollout, which means when I'm installing the software. And you also get a machine side and a user side for when I'm removing the software. So aside from telling it to run the Autodesk uninstaller, you can also like delete folders, clean stuff out of the registry, get rid of user shortcuts that they don't need that we manually put there. You can do all that as well. And then there's also what's called relocate a machine. And this is a specific command. So the PX tools are aware right now that my computers resolve in Dallas, John's reside in Austin, and Melissa's reside in Salt Lake City. So we can tell it during a relocate, change stuff on the machine. And this goes back to Tom's question about can't we leverage the Revit implementation to change the INI file? We totally can. But what's better about doing it this way is it's just a little more surgical in terms of the PX tools won't replace the INI. They won't even replace portions of the INI. So like the Autodesk method will like let you take sections of the INI file and replace it. The PX tools will actually open the INI file and look for the wild card called root content and replace it. So if I say, you know, let's say I'm going to go traveling today. If I tell my laptop to relocate from Dallas to mobile, which is our travel mode, you'll see that some paths change from the server to be on my hard drive. That means that things like my content navigators, my AutoCAD CUIXs that we were talking about, all that stuff can stay 100% the same so that all of the user experience is identical. When I get on my laptop, it's exactly like being on my desktop, right down to the family browser over here. The only difference is right now when I'm in the office, these families reside on the network, and when I'm traveling, they're actually stashed in a folder on my C drive temporarily, but I don't notice the difference when I'm working in Revit and I'm on the road, so it's fantastic. So these are the kind of things that you can do. And yeah, Tom, Autodesk's solution sucks. That's why that's why we do it this way. To be fair, though, it's a hard thing to manage. Now, I want to address one other question. There was a question earlier about PX Tools is currently doing a whole bunch of uninstalls on this machine that we fired up. So it's it finished the uninstalls and now it's doing the installs of the new software. So how does it know what to uninstall? Now here's the part that's tough with large organizations and IT folks. Even a tool like PX Tools, it works by having some semblance of control over your environment. So the uninstalls only happen if PX Tools was the tool that installed the software. And how I mean by that is when you're running PX Tools on a machine, it's tracking what it's done. So basically, this is my computer right now, which has not had 2021 deployed yet. So in PX Tools, all of these things say 2020. So what's going to happen is AutoCAD Architecture 2020 is listed in PX Tools in my machine's registry for PX Tools. If it doesn't see ACA 2020 in the set, it's going to yank it off. If it's in the set, but there's a new update, so like if you look at Revit, for instance, 2019, my machine has already done point release, point release, point release, point release. If there was a 2019.3, my machine would look at this during a conform and say 2019.3 is missing, run it. So you don't have to set up tasks to run, you set up a set to compare to. And as long as all of IT or the person responsible for the deployments is using PX Tools, it works like a champion. People really get skeptical and often don't believe me when I say that my old company, we were in 7 offices, and at the time it was varying between 600 and 700 people, and I was mostly the sole person who was doing the actual rollouts. Occasionally I would have IT help with a conform if we just wanted to roll out a point release mid-year. But by and large, I would either sneaker net, as we call it. I'd put on my sneakers on a Friday night and Saturday morning, and I'd run around to all the computers and click conform, or I would remote into them if they were in other offices. Now, here's where I'm going to get to the, I don't want to say the unsexy part, but the bummer part, as I like to call it. The fact that I actually go to the machines and run the conform manually while I'm physically logged in as an administrator is not a limitation of the tools themselves. If you were to go look at PX Tools, basically all of the commands that you run are commands that you can send either through command line or through PowerShell or through group policy, just like PDQ, just like SCCM. There is a reason that I go old school when I do deployments. And by old school, I mean I send emails out weeks and days in advance, and I tell all of the staff, now this is pre-COVID, mind you, I tell all the staff, life sucks, but this weekend your laptop is staying in the office. I'm sorry, I know you have deadlines. You'll always have deadlines. You're an architect. Your laptop is staying in the office. If you need to work this weekend, I will shoot you an email when your machine is done and you can come get it. there are all kinds of variables to consider here. There is like some folks like to use SCCM and PDQ, and they try to slide in behind the user. So like the user's logged into the machine and they're logged in as an administrator also doing deployments. Bad idea. If the Revit programs or the AutoCAD programs or even Bluebeam, if they're in use, the install will succeed, and then it'll go into what's called pending restart mode. And pending restart mode isn't a big deal for the deployments because you can just say suppress the restart and it will wait for the user to do a restart, but it can also bonk other installs in the list that have to get done. So like Revit 2020 might succeed and say, okay, Revit 2020 is now installed, but I'm waiting for a restart. And Revit 2021 may decide, hey, I'm not starting because there's a restart pending. So it's just not worth the aggravation. I have a super high success rate, and it's not really because I know anything more. It's just because I'm a pain in the ass. And I say, no, you're leaving your computer and we're installing it manually. Now, COVID obviously jacked that up, right? I'm certainly not getting 700 machines back in an office now. So, I mean, this webinar is not really meant to solve the issue of COVID. Deploying remotely is super, super hard. But here's what I can tell you from my experience in a past office where a lot of people were on job sites is if we take all these things that we just talked about, all of these methods, and we start compiling them together, let's look at what we've learned. At the beginning, we said we could build all of our deployments on the D drive or anywhere, doesn't matter where. And then if we wanted to give them a drive letter, we could basically go into our deployments and modify all of their INI files. Now, by the way, here's the other nice thing about Notepad++ is you're not opening all these files one at a time. You drag in your AutoCAD one, you drag in your AutoCAD electrical one, you drag in, and again, this is why being consistent in how you name things is key. So you spend 15 minutes and you get every deployment INI file you have open, and then you go down and you find the location you want to change, and you say, I would like to replace that with some ridiculous drive letter like the letter X. Now, why would I use the letter X? I don't like to use the letters at the bottom end because people's computers sometimes have extra hard drives and stuff. And if you've been to a built conference or an AU conference that I've been at, you probably haven't been there during setup the night before. Some of you have who have helped me with the booth and stuff, but there's always this funny thing happening the night before where a whole bunch of vendors brought brand new computers and forgot that the internet's gonna suck and they have to deploy Autodesk software. So we have what we call the X drive. The X drive is a super high-tech device that looks shockingly similar to a USB hard drive that I got on Amazon. Yeah, Chad, exactly. So you can do find and replace in all files and all open documents. That's basically what we do. So yeah, these super high-tech X drives, we have a bunch of them. And so what we do when we need to deploy in a booth at AU or at Built is we say find and replace and move everything to what we call the X drive. So I'm not going to do it because these are my live deployments, but basically we would change this thing to be X drive deploy. Okay. Now, after I do that, and I make a whole second set of deployments to do this, mind you. After I do that, we then copy all of the deployments onto that drive. And if I'm not going to plug in a USB drive. I'm not going to plug in a USB drive while we're on a webinar because computers like to freak out over stuff like that. But if you have them all on the X drive, and then we go back to the PX tools where we have locations, you'll see that we actually have a location setup called booths. And in the booths, everything is the same except all of the letters for where all the paths resolve is the letter X. So if I need to deploy in a booth tomorrow, I take my X drive, I get to the venue, I plug this thing into USB drive and I map this to the letter X. I open the folder that has the PX tools in it and I hit conform to set. And 4 hours later, the booth machine is ready to go. Okay, so you can actually deploy off of these. Now, a question just came in. Timon just asked, with users working remotely, if they leave their computers on VPN, will it work like leaving the 700 computers at the office? So here's something interesting, and I'm super glad you brought this up because I meant to talk about this earlier. I would never let a deployment run across a WAN, not even VPN. If you've got two offices, I'm in Dallas and John is in Austin and Melissa is in Salt Lake City. I would never let a machine in Salt Lake City run a deployment that is sitting in Dallas. I want to talk about why real quick. We've got 15 minutes, so we're okay. And we will have some question time. We may run a little long for question time, but I'll stick around if you guys have any questions. Here's what I want to tell you about deployments. They're not doing a whole lot, but they're really, really slow. They're really, and I'm not an IT person, so if any of you are, you can correct me on the facts of why this is in the chat. But basically, a deployment is copying thousands of tiny, tiny, tiny files. So if you get bored one day and you want to do a test on your computer, make a single file that's 100 megs and copy it from your machine to the server and then copy it back and time it. And then make 100 files that are a single meg and copy them the same way. The 100 files will take way longer because it's doing a whole bunch of extra checking and processing and stuff. So all this to say, deployments across a WAN should work, and officially they work, but they're super unreliable. If anything errors out, you're 40 minutes into a deployment before it tells you it failed. And then the problem is you've got some stuff that doesn't roll back gracefully, meaning we looked at all those prerequisites and postrequisites. So .NET succeeded, VCC redistributable succeeded, Revit succeeded, PACR failed, not because of the PACR issues, but because of a VPN connection that got shoddy. Now it tries to roll everything back. Maybe it succeeds, maybe it doesn't. So for me, literally, it's not worth the hassle. Now, I get it. In our current COVID or post-COVID world, it may be a reality that people are going to be deploying from home. So I know this doesn't sound practical, but literally, these things are super inexpensive. I've got 6 of them sitting here. And what I used to do is put them in an envelope. And this was when I just had to get deployments to different offices, but I would literally overnight them and send a list of addresses. And the person who got the hard drive first, they plugged it in, we remoted in, we did the deployment, which ran in a few hours, then they crossed out their name and it got mailed to, this is like interoffice mail. Like people used to do this in the 90s. Like this was a thing, or the 80s, So mailing them around, obviously, if you have 700 people working remotely, it's not an awesome situation. What I would say, secondly, to that question is if you don't want to mail hard drives around, if you want to try something a little more elegant, you can absolutely leverage a copying scenario off VPN, right? So you could basically tell a GPO or a login script or even a routine that they double click and run, copy our entire deployment package temporarily locally, and then try to run PXTools or PDQ or SCCM, whatever you want to do based on the local path, and then delete them all. The trouble with that is you've just got to have some massive freaking hard drives. So Matt just asked a question, do I need to run PXTools manually or can you push it out to the entire office? You can push it. It's like I said, you could push it through a command line or through a GPO, or you could even use SCCM or PDQ to push it. I've seen it done all 4 ways. I am old school. So we have one client specifically where I physically go to their office once a year. I'm there for a weekend and I do all of their deployments. And we have all those tools at our disposal. But in that office, I physically log into the machines and I double click the conform. And then I walk to the next machine and I log in and I click conform and I walk to the next machine and I do it. Because seriously, like it's a couple hundred machines. It only takes a few hours to start them all. But by the time I get to the end of starting them, some of the ones at the beginning have finished. And that means, by the way, I can review the logs because you're getting logs for every machine that's running PXTools. And so if I go and look at a log, it'll actually tell us every single thing that's happened. Now you get the Autodesk logs, of course, right? Like Autodesk will tell you what succeeded and failed in their deployment. But this one is really nice because it'll basically tell you, oh, this is when I did a relocate test. But it'll basically tell you, I relocated a shortcut, I relocated a shortcut, I relocated the Revit INI file, I relocated the INI file. And if you go look at one from an actual deployment, oh, so here's the one that we started earlier. So the log's telling you I'm uninstalling AutoCAD 2020, uninstalling ACE, uninstalling ACM, uninstalling Advanced Steel. One of our clients got super nerdy and built an XML parser or something, or a log parser that actually compiles all the logs so they can just read it in the dashboard. It was really, really kind of nerdy and awesome. But all that to say, yeah, Matt, you absolutely can push it. I don't like to, and there's a couple of reasons. One, a lot of these installers and deployments are best handled if you are certain the machine has been restarted recently. So I send out an email to all the staff and I say, restart your machine and be logged out, Friday at happy hour. And that's typically when I start rollouts, is on a Friday night, because even with PX tools, there's always one machine in the office that just stuff's broke. And that machine's going to be wrecked come Saturday morning. It's just stuff's going to be corrupted, licensing is going to be jacked up. And I like to have a day or two reaction time to fix that machine. So for me, deployments are always on a Friday night for the big rollout. If you want to like knock out a point release on a weeknight, you can, whatever. But I always do mine on a Friday night. And then yeah. So yeah, you can absolutely push it, but there's two things I like to do is when I go log in as an admin and then I manually click conform, the first thing I do is I restart all the machines myself. So like there'll be like 10 desks in a little cluster together, and I'll control alt delete restart, control alt delete restart, control alt delete restart. And by the time I get back to the first machine, it's ready for me to log in and run it. Now, that's not a requirement of this method. And again, this is not like a brag sesh or anything, but people ask why I have very little problems with deployments, and I say it's really kind of just a factor of a lot of small things that I do to make sure these things don't get all jacked up. So Josh asked, how much testing do I do before an office-wide rollout? It depends on if you mean testing of the deployment setup or testing of the software itself. We test both. So like, by the way, deployments is obviously not my full-time job, so we're doing other things as well. So like, it's not like I spend 40 hours a week on this, but basically this VM that we're on right now is our 2021 test bench at Parallax. So we have 2021 deployed fully. I'm in it, I'm using it. I will test it. I will actually test the software itself before we'll actually roll it out. I'll open a couple of models here and there. We will test all of our add-ins. And by the way, that's why we haven't rolled out 2021 yet, is we're still waiting for a couple of developers to get their add-ins upgraded to 2021. So I personally am not one of those folks who believes in waiting until 2021.1. That's not because I have confidence that 2021 is okay. It's because 2021.1 is still going to have its issues. So why not just roll out the first one? So the deployment testing, I do a fair amount. So you may have noticed I keep 3 virtual machines in Hyper-V. One of them is absolutely bare Windows. It has nothing on it whatsoever. And my first run will be installing everything on bare Windows. And that's more just to check myself. Did I make a typo with the deployment setup? Is everything pathing correctly? Are all of my customizations like INI files and stuff good? So I always start there, bare Windows, run PX tools, then check all the software, see if it's set up the way I want. Then I go to what I call our current machine. So this machine is current as in it has 2020 deployed. That's the machine I test on next because that's the most important. Like that's the machine where if there's going to be a conflict with a redistributable or a conflict with a different version of Revit, that's where you're going to find it. Now, here's the part that sucks. If you want to do it right, and for our clients, we obviously are way more careful. I mean, I'm careful with our machines, but for our clients, when you deploy on this machine and you want to test it, you don't just test 21. You got to go back and open 20 and open 19 and open 18 and open 17 because there's a chance you're breaking old stuff with new stuff, particularly because of how add-ins get built, right? So we use the CTC suites for a lot of stuff, and none of their stuff broke, mind you, but most of the current add-in developers are only supporting like 3 versions of Revit. So if you install 20, you get 20, 19, 18. So when I'm doing my testing on this actual machine, that's when I launch Revit 2017 and realize the CTC suite is gone. And I'm like, oh, nuts. Now, I get it. You probably don't need 17 anymore. You probably don't need 16 anymore. If you're a content developer, it's a little different. So I wanted to know that during testing so I could build my mechanism to shoehorn the CTC suites back into 16 and 17, which is kind of doable. I feel like I missed a question. So Chris is pushing it through PowerShell. Yep, totally. Let's see here. I missed oh, can it grab from SharePoint Online? It might be able to. You're going to get into some authentication stuff there. So I would defer to Gordon, and that's probably a question that would have to go offline because I'm not terribly certain. What I can say, though, is, again, so SharePoint Online, to me, it's the same as, for me, it's less about VPN and it's more about running a deployment when you're not 100% sure the deployment resources are 100% accessible. If you're relying on the internet to get to a resource, there's a chance that resource is going to fail during install. And for me, that's a scary proposition. But kind of a quick thing. So what I was talking about is we actually we did another neat little trick when we had to deploy to job sites, and this is kind of where like the COVID situation comes in. Is I used to mail these hard drives out to job sites, because job sites, you wouldn't have to mail it one-to-one. You wouldn't have to mail a hard drive to every person, but you'd have 20 people that were out on one job site. And this is not a good safety thing. I probably shouldn't like just show this to 30 people on a call, but using that trick that we were looking at earlier, where I said, hey, if you want to make a deployment to the iDrive and it won't let you, you can actually make a deployment and type in, like we said earlier, localhost $, and that will absolutely work in an Autodesk deployment, because it thinks you're giving it a UNC path because you typed in localhost. So what's funny about that is, in a pinch, when I had to do testing where we had to get deployments out to a job site, I would mail the deployment out there, the hard drive, and I would plug it into one computer that was in the job site trailer, because you could actually convert the path to that machine name and C drive and then deploy, or X drive, as the case would be. So then other people would be running the deployment by pulling it off another machine's hard drive. Super ghetto. But the point is, if you have like 10 people in a small location and you need to do that, you could do it. So we got a question about, can you redirect the add-in folder location? I think, are you talking about running the add-ins from another location? Because you can do that. I did it for 1 year in 2013, 2014. We ran all of our add-ins from a network location. I would never do it again. It runs fine. Your IT folks freak out because you've got DLLs running on the network, but also the performance really takes a hit. And this goes back to the Dynamo stuff as well. I want to open up real quick. You guys can keep posting questions if you have them. Dustin, I'll answer that one in a second, but I want to open up our Dynamo definition. So we've got a bunch of old versions of Dynamo in here. If I go down to, so I'm currently calling our new version at 2.x, right? And this comes down to kudos to the Dynamo team. Kudos to the Dynamo team. They finally built Dynamo into Revit, so we don't need to worry about the installs anymore. Now, you will notice that in our 2.x, it is still installing 2.0.3. That's for older versions of Revit. And this can probably go away. I need to take another look at it. But here's what's cool about it, right? We have our packages, and I apologize if some of you have to drop because I'm rambling. That's totally cool. I won't take it too personally. Cry in my coffee after. No. I'm going to just go to deploy, and I'm going to go to Autodesk and to Dynamo. And I'm going to go to, you'll see here that we have a folder called packages. Now we've kind of changed the way we've done this recently to react to Autodesk's changes, which again, I want to say are a positive thing. But you'll notice that now we just have a folder called 2.x. And there's a whole bunch of packages in there that basically somebody in the office needs to curate. If you're the BIM manager, that's you. We're spoiled because here it's John. So we basically have somebody curating a package called, or a folder called 2.x. Now what we tell PX tools to do is we move it to a staging location. So during conform, or every single time the user logs in. And here's what's kind of cool. We're doing it during the conform just as a precautionary measure, but we're also doing it every time the user logs in. So we're copying the packages off the server into what I call a staging area. That's just under C Parallax. Now, it is true, similar to the add-ins that Frank's asking about, it is true that you can repath where Dynamo accesses its packages. Your mileage may vary. I don't like to do it because with add-ins and with Dynamo specifically, there is a small amount that you're banking that the package developer has planned on that. And if they've hard-coded a path to something, it just can wreck your world. So here's what we do. We're not running the packages from this 2.x location. We're copying them there during the conform. And the reason we do it during the conform is I'm certain that at the conform, the deployment drive is there. Then when the user logs in, what it does is kind of cool because you'll see here that we're copying it from our ambiguous folder called 2.x into 2.0, 2.1, 2.2, 2.3, 2.4, and 2.5. So yes, it's a little wasteful because it's copying it into 6 locations, but since Revit and Dynamo want to run off unique locations, we're making sure we have the current packages in all of the 2.x versions and nobody's having to do it. I also want to point out that in PX Tools, Gordon is leveraging like a robocopy mirror. So this is not sucking up massive bandwidth because it's not a brute force copy every day. It's doing a comparison. It's copying changes. So it's super fast, which is great. So we've got some notes from John about moving your packages to the network. That's handy. So Frank, yeah, if you want to redirect them to a D drive, you totally can. Personally, because we have the means here to keep everything in the normal location and manage it, I don't. I put everything right where it goes, even the ones that I install special. And so Matt asked a question of, does it work with other tools other than Autodesk? Absolutely. Not all of the tools that you mentioned there. So, excuse me. Does it work with Rhino? Absolutely. I just installed Rhino. We're getting Rhino internally for the first time, and we're deploying it. So Rhino, yes. Synchro, yes. Some interesting little add-ins that we've done for clients called View Companion, Revisto, BIM Track, the Parallax apps. You can deploy Notepad++ with it. Inkscape, GIMP, Enscape, Classic Shell, by Cortana, bulk rename utility, Bluebeam. All of these things are handled by PX Tools here. There's also, I've got a folder of ones that we've done before. So yes, you can do SketchUp. I need to check on the newest version of SketchUp because of how licensing works. You can do ComCheck if anybody here still has to use it. Scribus if you're using Scape because you don't want to pay for Adobe. You can't do Adobe. Adobe, the way their installer works is super annoying. At least I don't have the skills to do Adobe. I'm pretty sure you can't do it. Similarly, I don't do the Office applications with it. I don't do Office 365 with it. What I do is customize Office with it. So it's a very small thing, but like when you launch Office or Microsoft Word in our office, like all of our templates are there based on shared template locations. Same with PowerPoint, same with Excel. We do all of that with PX Tools just because it's better than trying to learn the stupid format that Microsoft wants you to use. So we do that. And I missed a question here from Dustin. With PX Tools uninstall, install working only if PX installed the software. How do you handle it if a user Google searches and installs the software? Yeah, heck yeah, that's an awesome question. This may seem like I'm a bit of a control freak, but again, given the amount of success I've had with deployments, you can kind of take this or leave it. It's 2020, and if you're still letting your users install software on their machine, you're freaking crazy. So I know that sounds hypocritical because like, at Parallax, John and Melissa can obviously install whatever they want on machines, but that's also because we're a bespoke consultancy and we treat all of our machines as expendable. I mean, if we wreck a machine tomorrow, we re-image it and redeploy everything, and it takes about 4 hours. In a company of more than like 5 people, I think everybody's account, including the BIM managers, should be locked down. And then if the BIM manager needs admin rights, I think you give them a second admin account. That's the only way to be secure, especially with everything going on with cybersecurity right now. And I'm sure you all, not to go on a different diatribe, but I'm sure you all saw the tweets and the article that Zaha Hadid Architects was hit by ransomware this month. That's not a rare thing. 4 of our different clients have been hit in the last 2 years. It's not a commonality with us. It has to do with AEC firms are actually being targeted because the bad actors around cybersecurity have gotten wise to the fact that security in the average AEC firm sucks. They're easy targets. Chad asked, doesn't AutoCAD need admin rights to function properly? That is not the case. And by the way, just to throw this out there, I've heard that from BIM managers recently about Revit as well. These things used to be the case, and it was true. There was actually a time when your Revit INI file was in program files. It wasn't in user app data, which meant it wasn't Microsoft compliant. And if you didn't have admin rights, you couldn't save any settings or make any changes. That hasn't been the case though. The last time I recall that being the case was like literally Revit 2009. And AutoCAD, it was way earlier than that because when I was a BIM manager in New York in 2008, nobody had admin rights and AutoCAD ran like a champ. Yeah, you can call it AutoBAD if you want. It's everybody whines and cries that they hate AutoCAD, but AutoCAD is super useful for a lot of things. So having said that, yeah, can't do Adobe that I know of, but everything else works really well. So I ran a little long on time. If you guys have more questions, I'll stick around. I hope this was helpful. I hope I covered the things that everybody wanted to go over or that thought I would go over. It was kind of weird. Like I said, I was just tweeting about random stuff I was doing, and I was kind of surprised people wanted to jump in and listen to deployment stuff. But I will just show you like 2 or 3 more kind of funny things. Is what I want you to take away from this is, aside from the Autodesk deployment stuff, I want you to just think about, we talked about there being different contexts. So what happens on the machine side and what happens on the user side during an install, a removal, and a relocate. I want you to think about what you would do if suddenly you could do things like that every day. Because what's really cool is the fact that there is a user task that runs every single day, kind of like Big Brother, right? So if I look at this, user settings that happen because Revit 2021 is installed. Now, it's not going to copy app data every day. We have that set to be a one-time task, but I want you to imagine that somebody in your architecture office just made a badass new material library and stuck it on the server, and you want to repath everybody to, you want to add that path into everybody's material config.xml. So just a quick little example here. When you deploy, whether or not these libraries are here, including Parallax materials, that all has to do with a file that's called material config.xml. I'm sorry, material UI config.xml that lives in their app data. That means you'd have to copy something into everybody's app data in order to get them that new library. Or I could do it without touching a single machine here, because PX Tools is already running at user login every day. Once you've started PX Tools, like once you've done the first set, conform, it's not going to conform every day, but it's going to run all the user tasks every day. So if I literally come in here and say, okay, Revit, I'm gonna just ghetto add a copy task right here, okay, I did that wrong, but let's just say I copied this whole task right here. Gordon, like in 3 days when I message you and all of my stuff's broken, remind me that I was jacking with it on a video, on a demo. So if I say copy new material library once, pretend I can type, and I path to the one on the server and I path to where it has to go in the user's roaming app data, it's going to copy it the next time the user logs in the machine, because the user side of this is running every day. And then if I simply go and have it also recopy their material UI config, I can literally add a material library to everybody's computer in the company and not touch a single machine. That's where the power of this really comes in. And that's where we've just done some other goofy little stuff, like, putting network shortcuts where everybody can get to them. If you have an employee handbook, we have it just pop up on top of everybody's desktop so that they could just get to it. There's not much there for 3 of us. Yeah, you can change your start button if you want to. It's kind of fun. You can do your desktop backgrounds. You can install things like desktop info 150, which I do. And Melissa and John will tell you, like, I sometimes need that because we have some broken IT problems occasionally because I'm not an IT person. So anyways, yeah, that's all I got. I hope everybody's having a good week. If you want to catch the replay, it'll be on YouTube. If you do want the resource materials, really all there is the 2 Bob Bell handouts, which are awesome. And the videos are of those, the videos of the rollout samples are on YouTube already if you want to check those out. John wants to know, can you make Internet Explorer the default browser? That's awesome. Yeah, thanks everyone for coming, and happy Thursday. Have a good rest of your week. I'm gonna go hang out with Adeline for a couple of hours so that Allie and I are trading off during the COVID experience. So we've got my spare desk over here is set up for Allie, and she's working for Stantec from here. So we're gonna go trade off so she can get some work done. So I would talk to all of y'all later. Thanks for hanging out with me on a Thursday morning, and have fun out there.